everyone. My name is Denise Harlow. I'm the CEO of the National Community Action Partnership, and we are thrilled to have you on today's webinar focusing on the proposed public charge rule. We are recording today's webinar so that we can share with you this recording after today, as well as post it up on our website. Just keep that in mind. I know we're not going to open up the lines for Q&A, but we do have a Q&A window. Off to the right-hand side of your window, you should see a spot where if you have questions today, I hope that you'll post them. We will be also sharing the slides as well as the recording with everyone who's registered for today's webinar, as well as put it up on our website. So you will have access to this information following today's webinar. We will also provide you with a template that you can use to submit your own comments, which we hope you will do, around the public charge. But we're going to dive into the details of that going forward. But all that stuff will be made available, and if you can't find it, email me, and we'll make sure to send it to you. Today's webinar is really a joint effort across the National Community Action Partner Organizations. We are thrilled to be partnering today with CapLaw. We have Veronica Zhang, who will be our primary CapLaw presenter, and Eleanor Evans will also be online and available for questions as well. We're also joined by Eric Baina from NASCAP, our sister organization working with states, and we have a number of state offices on the phone with us today as well. We had I think we had over 300 local agencies, state associations, and state CSBG offices sign on for today's webinar. That is just fantastic. I think it really shows the appetite for investigating the public policy and regulatory aspects of issues that are impacting families across our communities, and certainly immigration. We are not one for news and information on immigration right now. We know what's going on regarding the wall and the border, the political rhetoric, as well as some of the violence that's been going on near the border, and we still know how many children are still separated from their parents across this country. So this is a timely topic for today's conversation. I'm thrilled so many community action folks from around the country are on today's webinar. We're going to be covering a number of different things across today's agenda. We are going to be talking about what is the public charge, and my guess is a number of you may have been on webinars, whether done by CLASP, CHN, the National Immigration Law Center. A number of groups have held webinars or have done some deep dive webinars on particular populations that we have certainly attended and learned from. We thought it was important to do what is the public charge kind of webinar specifically for community action. Veronica is going to give us a great overview about what it is, what the public charge test is, what's going to be proposed, what is proposed, excuse me, in the proposed rule change. We're going to talk about how that will impact community action specifically, agencies, as well as our customers that come in the door every day. And then we're going to talk about how you, as local agencies, state associations, and state CSBG offices, can respond, be engaged, and make your voice heard. And one of the things to keep in the back of your mind is the advocacy community is really hoping that a number of folks will submit individual comments. Under law, and Veronica will dive into this, or Eric might, that they are required to consider every comment proposed or put forth. So we are very concerned about these proposed changes. We want to make sure our voices are heard, and we hope that states, local agencies, and associations will submit their own comments. And as I said, we'll have a template to kind of get you started with that. So with that, I'm going to turn the ball over literally to Veronica over at CapLaw, and she will take us through the nitty-gritty, the details. Thanks, everyone. Take it away, Veronica.
Great. Thanks so much, Denise. Hi, everyone. This is Veronica Zhang at CapLaw, and we just wanted to start by providing the network an overview of the current public charge rules and also what the Department of Homeland Security is proposing to change in this proposal. So public charge is a concept that has always existed under federal immigration law. It's one of the grounds of inadmissibility that could prevent someone from being admitted to the U.S. on a visa or receiving a green card. So when an individual applies for a visa to enter the U.S. or applies to become a legal permanent resident, there are many grounds for which an immigration official could deny that person a visa or a green card, and being a public charge is one of those grounds of inadmissibility. And so the idea here is that an individual is inadmissible if that person is likely to become a public charge at any time. And this is a rule that is found in the Immigration and Nationality Act in Section 212A4. So this concept has always existed under federal immigration law. The change is that about a month ago, on October 10th, the Department of Homeland Security proposed a new rule for determining how that public charge test would be applied. And so the upshot of the rule, and we'll talk about some of the details and what is actually changing, is that this rule would make it harder for immigrants to enter the U.S. and advance through the immigration process if they have applied for or used public benefits. And so this proposal was released in the Federal Register on October 10th, and we're currently in a 90-day public comment process where the Department of Homeland Security is soliciting public feedback and input on the rule, after which it will consider those comments before issuing a final rule. So it's important to note that this rule that we're talking about today is just a proposed rule, and nothing has actually changed yet. So the public charge test applies, as I mentioned, when a person applies to enter the U.S., so applies for a visa, and that can either be overseas or is applying to switch visas after they've arrived in the U.S., or when they're applying to adjust their immigration status to a lawful permanent resident, which is the way of saying applying for a green card. If a green card holder leaves the U.S. for more than 180 days and re-enters the U.S., there's a new public charge assessment made at that time. There are many categories of immigrants who are not subject to the public charge test or who can get a waiver from the public charge assessment. And these categories include refugees, asylees, victims of domestic violence, so VAWA visas or petitions, victims of trafficking, so those who are applying for T visas, victims of other violent crimes, those who are applying for U visas, for example. And it also doesn't apply to special immigrant juveniles, to those who are renewing their DACA status. So those types of immigration petitions are not subject to the public charge assessment. So it's important to know when the public charge test applies and when it doesn't apply. A public charge assessment also does not apply when someone is applying to become a U.S. citizen, so the naturalization process. Remember, the public charge assessment applies when you're applying for a green card, but once you've received that green card, there's not a new public charge assessment made during the naturalization process. So what is the current public charge test? The test is currently found in interim field guidance, which was released by INS, which was the precursor agency to DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and this has been in place since 1999. Under the current rule, immigration officers decide whether a person is likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. This is the definition of a public charge, as someone who is primarily dependent on the government for support. And to decide this, immigration officers rely on a number of different factors, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but they also will consider whether that immigrant has used certain public benefits in the past. The only two types of public benefits that are considered under the current test are cash assistance for income maintenance, and so this would be SSI, as well as TANF cash benefits, or institutionalization for long-term care at the government's expense. So again, the current rule does consider an immigrant's use of public benefits in the past, but only these two types of benefits, cash assistance and institutionalization for long-term care, are considered in the public charge test. You'll notice when we talk about how the rule is proposed to be changed is that use of healthcare, nutrition, and housing programs, so non-cash benefits, are not considered in the public charge test. And the public policy behind this, and the interim field guidance talks about this, is that these programs are recognized as vital to keeping our communities healthy and safe, and ensuring that individuals who receive them are able to be productive and able to look for jobs or work. And when this initial test, the current test, was developed, INS consulted agencies such as the Department of Health and Human Services and the Social Security Administration and USDA, and those agencies had advised at the time that only cash assistance should be considered, and non-cash assistance, such as food stamps, should not be factored into the public charge test. The current public charge test also looks beyond public benefits and looks at the totality of the applicant's circumstances. And so these are the factors that are required under the federal statute, and immigration officials have to consider all of them at a minimum. So these include the immigrant's age, health, their family status, their assets, resources, and financial status, which is where the immigrant's use of public benefits becomes a factor, as well as the immigrant's education and skills, including their English language proficiency. And immigration officials also have to consider what's known as an affidavit of support, which is a contract essentially from a sponsor of an immigrant, essentially guaranteeing that the immigrant will not become dependent primarily on the government for support. So receiving public benefits under the current test doesn't automatically make an individual a public charge. As you can see, all of these circumstances have to be considered, and officers are not supposed to rely on any single factor. The test is forward-looking, and the question is always, is the person likely to become primarily dependent on the government for support in the future? And positive factors can outweigh negative factors. So now that we've talked about the current public charge test, let's look at what would change under the current proposal. So there are three main changes in this rule, and we'll talk about each of them in depth in the next few slides. The first is that there is a new definition of public charge, which makes it much more likely that someone who has used one or more public benefits in the past would be considered a public charge. The second change is that the proposed rule would expand the list of publicly funded programs that immigration officers can consider when deciding whether someone is likely to become a public charge. So as we saw in the prior slides, currently only cash assistance, so TANF, SSI, and other state or local cash-only programs are counted as strikes against an immigrant when they're applying for a visa or a green card. The proposed rule would expand the list of public benefits that are considered in the public charge determination. The third change is that it changes the totality of circumstances calculus. While the test and the factors remain the same, DHS is proposing heavily weighting some of the factors, and one of those factors is the use of public benefits. The application and use of public benefits in the past would count as heavily negative factors for an individual when they're applying for a visa or a green card. So the upshot of these changes is that it makes it much more difficult for immigrants who have applied for or used in the past or are currently receiving public benefits to pass the public charge test, which would mean that ultimately these immigrants would be more likely to be denied a visa or a green card. So it's important to know that, again, nothing has changed yet, that this is a proposed rule that DHS has submitted for a 90-day public comment process. That period ends on December the 10th, and we'll talk about ways that community action agencies can weigh in on these changes and express concerns about the impact that the proposed rule would have on their communities. But until the final rule is issued by DHS, the current public charge test would remain the same. So the first change the first major change under the proposed rule is that DHS is proposing a new definition of public charge. Under the current rule, a public charge is an immigrant who is likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. Primarily dependent is defined as the majority or more than 50%. So in other words, under current law, a public charge is someone for whom public benefits represent more than half of their income and support. As you can see, the proposed rule lowers that threshold significantly. Under the new rule, or the proposed rule, an immigrant is a public charge if they are likely at any time in the future to receive one or more public benefits. So in the proposed rule, DHS rejected very clearly the 50% threshold. And it said that even though the 50% rule is a bright line test, it felt that individuals who were below this threshold would still lack self-sufficiency and likely be dependent on the public for support. And so again, this change means that an individual's receipt of public benefits, even in relatively small amounts or for a relatively short duration of time, would in many cases be sufficient to make that person a public charge. The second change, which is where a lot of the attention has focused, is that the list of benefits that would count as strikes against an immigrant in the public charge determination has expanded greatly. So here on this slide, you can see that the current public benefits that are factored into the public charge determination under the current rule are highlighted in this golden yellow. And so those include TANF cash assistance, and SSI, as well as other federal, state, or local cash assistance programs. These are often known as general assistance programs that enable an individual to maintain their income. And then secondly, aside from cash assistance, government-funded long-term institutional care is a public benefit that would count as a strike against an immigrant who's applying for a visa or a green card. Under the proposed rule, the public benefits that are in green here would also be counted. So these, as you can see, are all non-cash benefits and benefits that specifically under the current rule were rejected. So under the proposed rule, an immigrant's use of SNAP, so food stamps benefits, as well as Medicaid, with exceptions for emergency medical services and certain disability services that are offered in schools under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So Medicaid benefits would be counted. Medicare Part D is another benefit that is offered to individuals who meet income eligibility requirements. So Medicare Part D is the prescription drug coverage benefit under Medicare. So an individual's receipt of a low-income subsidy under Medicare Part D, so these are subsidies to help pay for prescription drug coverage under Medicare, would count as a strike against that immigrant, as well as housing assistance programs. And so these are a variety of HUD administered programs, and they include Section 8 vouchers, as well as Section 8 project-based rental assistance, and then also subsidized housing that is provided under the Federal Housing Act of 1937. So this is your general subsidized public housing. Application for and receipt of, or current receipt of, these benefits would all count as strikes against the immigrant. And so as you can see, the combination of this change and the change that we mentioned on the previous slide, which lowered the threshold from an immigrant being a public charge if they are primarily dependent on the government for support, to under the new rule would be, if the immigrant is likely at any time to use one or more of these benefits, and now this list of benefits that are considered would be expanded, means that it's much more likely for immigrants to be determined to be a public charge if they've used or applied for any of these benefits in the past. The last benefit on this slide, which is CHIP, is highlighted in blue, is not proposed to be added under the proposed rule, but DHS is asking for public input on whether or not it should, in the final rule, count the use of CHIP as a strike against the immigrant. So CHIP is the Children's Health Insurance Program, and CHIP provides low-cost health coverage to children and families that earn too much money to qualify for Medicaid but still need assistance to pay for health care costs. Just as a data point, 46 states and DC cover children and families with income at 250% of the federal poverty level or higher. So CHIP is meant to be a sort of stopgap between qualifying for Medicaid and having to pay for private insurance, either on the marketplace or through an employer, and the coverage is specifically for children. CHIP has gotten a lot of attention, particularly from the medical provider world, as well as pediatrics advocacy groups, because CHIP really does enjoy broad bipartisan support. And one of the things that many commenters are noting in their responses to DHS is that including CHIP on this list of public benefits would lead to children foregoing care, both because of the fact that it's included on the list, but also because of the chilling effect where immigrant families, are afraid to take to use CHIP and to take their children to access, preventative care and routine immunizations and vaccines, because they're afraid that that could lead to separation of their families in the future. So one of the things to think about as you are considering weighing in on the proposed rule is to weigh in on CHIP specifically, and especially if you have a Head Start program or if your community action agency serves children, immigrant children, to talk about the impact that including CHIP would have on immigrant families' well-being, as well as their children's health. For community action agencies, it's also important to know what public benefits are not considered. So any benefit that is not specifically listed in the rule would not be counted. And so specifically, the rule does not include CSBG, it doesn't include LIHEAP or weatherization or WIC, other non-cash benefits that provide education or job training, such as Head Start or school-based nutrition, so school breakfast and lunch, free and reduced lunch, or WIOA programs would not count. Other benefits that aren't considered are transportation vouchers or other non-cash transportation services. The federal earned income tax credit and any child care or child tax credit would not be considered. Disaster relief, emergency medical assistance, as we mentioned, emergency medical assistance was accepted out of Medicaid. So remember, the new rule would include the use of Medicaid. However, if it's Medicaid for emergency medical assistance, then that would not be factored into the public charge determination. And other entirely state, local, or tribal programs other than cash assistance programs. So if your state provides other nutrition-based or education-based or job training programs that are not cash assistance, and as long as those are not SNAP or Medicaid or CHIP, if CHIP is ultimately included, those would not count in the public charge determination. Again, just a reminder that CHIP under the rule as proposed is not a benefit that would count against the immigrant. However, DHS is considering whether to include CHIP. And then lastly, benefits that are received by the immigrant's family members do not count. So the public charge determination applies to each individual immigrant. So if the applicant is a child or if the applicant is just an adult, and this happens oftentimes in what we call blended families, where the children may be U.S. citizens because they were born in the U.S., but mom and dad may be, here on a visa, looking to potentially adjust their status to become lawful permanent residents or to get a green card. The children's receipt of benefits would not count against the parents' public charge determination, and vice versa. So the proposed rule continues to use the totality of circumstances test. These are the factors that are mandated by Congress in the federal statute. These are the factors that currently apply. What has changed is that the proposed rule changes the calculus of each factor. It identifies certain factors as carrying greater weight than others, and so these are what DHS refers to as heavily weighted factors, both heavily weighted positive factors as well as negative factors. And we'll talk about what those factors are. So under the current law, none of these factors are determinative, whereas under the proposed rule, there are certain factors that would count more than others. So let's look at those factors. This slide shows factors that are considered carrying heavy weight in the public charge determination. Some of the heavily weighted negative factors include the immigrant's lack of job or job prospects, the receipt of public benefits, and so it's both past application or receipt of public benefits, as well as current receipt of public benefits, as well as being certified to receive but not actually receiving public benefits. So if an application for SNAP, for example, for food stamps is approved, but the immigrant hasn't actually used any of those public benefits, that certification would also count as a heavily weighted negative factor. The last is having a health condition without private insurance or the funds to be able to pay for the care for that condition. There are also some heavily weighted positive factors that DHS has identified in this rule. The primary one being that the individual or household has an income at 250% of the federal poverty line or higher. So the next few slides just walks through each of the factors that go into the totality of circumstances test. We're not going to spend too much time going into each of these factors because, again, the focus of this presentation is about the use of public benefits and then how it affects community action. But just so that you see some of the ways that an immigration officer would consider an applicant and how they would look at each factor. So in terms of age, negative factors are if the individual is too old, so older than 61, or too young, younger than 18. And a positive factor is if this person falls within the age range of 18 to 60. It's important to think about some of these factors because if you have a client who does not receive public benefits, any of those public benefits on that expanded list, and has never applied for those benefits in the past, you still have to think about these other circumstances, these other factors that could lead an immigration officer to conclude that that person is likely to receive one or more public benefits in the future. Again, just because they haven't received any public benefits currently or in the past doesn't mean that these other factors that DHS is explicitly stating wouldn't lead the immigration officer to conclude that that person is likely to receive a benefit in the future. Again, under the current rule, age is considered, but the current policy has never spelled out these age ranges, so being over 61 or younger than 18 as being negative factors. The immigrant's health is also part of the totality of circumstances test. If this person has been diagnosed with a medical condition that will interfere with that person's ability to work or to attend school, that's considered a negative factor. A positive factor is, having a clean bill of health, and that would weigh against any other negative factors. Under family status, immigration officers are considering whether the individual has a household to support. So whether this individual's household size makes him or her more or less likely to become a public charge. Is this person being supported by another household? And is the household income sufficient to provide for everyone who's in that household? This factor is usually viewed in connection with the individual's assets and resources. And as we'll talk about in the next slide, DHS considers whether the individual can support himself or herself and whether that individual's household income is at 125% of the most recent federal poverty guidelines. Just a reminder that if a child or family member is an immigrant, his or her own use of benefits counts towards his or own public charge determination. It doesn't count against the public charge determination of a family member. So the immigrant's assets and income continues to be the primary factor that immigration officials will consider. And so here you can see a number of negative factors that would count against that applicant. First is if the person's income or household income is at 125% of the federal poverty line or lower, current or past receipt of public benefits, and that includes past application for benefits or certification to receive public benefits. Also, if the person has ever applied for a fee waiver, so when you're applying for a visa or applying to adjust your immigration status, there's often the opportunity to apply to have that fee waived. And so if the person has ever applied for a fee waiver, that counts as a negative factor. DHS will require, under the new rule, immigrants to submit a credit check, and having a negative credit history or a low credit score will count as a negative factor against the applicant. Also, not having any private health insurance will count as a negative factor. On the other hand, if the individual can show that they have individual or household income at 250% of the federal poverty line or higher, that is considered a heavily weighted positive factor. And just to give you some data, 250% of the federal poverty line is around $63,000, and so essentially what this rule is saying is that, earning $63,000 for a family of four, so to avoid scrutiny under the public charge test, a family of four would have to earn that amount, that $63,000 or higher, since that would be a heavily weighted positive factor. Immigration officials also consider the immigrant's education and skills, so not having a high school degree or equivalent or not being proficient in English would count as negative factors, and on the other hand, having an advanced degree, being proficient in English counts as positive factors. So you can see that this rule essentially penalizes individuals who have lower education levels or have lower English proficiency, which we know is associated with poverty. So questions that often come up are, how does this rule, as proposed, impact public benefits that an individual currently receives? So it's important to know, and especially as you're talking to families that you work with who may be immigrants and who are receiving or considering applying for public benefits, is that the changes proposed in this new rule are not retroactive. That means that if this rule is ever finalized, application for or receipt of food stamps or Medicaid or any of the public benefits on that expanded list before the effective date of that final rule would not count in the public charge determination. So if the individual received that benefit before the proposed rule is finalized, and if those rules are currently excluded from the public charge test, so those are benefits other than TANF or SSI or long-term care, those benefits would not be considered in the person's public charge determination. So as we said, we're in the 90-day comment period right now. After the comment period closes, DHS is required by law to consider all unique comments that are submitted, which is why we are encouraging members of the Community Action Network to submit comments, and we'll talk about how to do that. But DHS then has to release a final rule, and usually there is a period of time before that final rule goes into effect. And so if there is a final rule that looks similar to the rule as proposed, then there is a window of time in which families that are concerned about their immigration status and eligibility for a visa or green card to disenroll in public benefits that would count against their public charge determination. So for CAAs who work with immigrant families, you just want to be aware that based on the proposed rule, there is no reason why immigrants should disenroll from Medicaid or food stamps or public housing or subsidized housing programs before the final rule goes into effect. There's been a lot of, I think, fear-mongering around the proposed rule, and we'll talk about the chilling effect that this rule could have, but until the final rule is proposed, use of an application for benefits under the proposed rule would not count against the public charge determination. And then also, there have been questions about whether this rule affects an individual's ability or eligibility to receive public benefits. And so the answer to that is no, that the rule doesn't change the criteria for receiving public benefits. And in many ways, it's why this rule is so hurtful in many ways, is that Congress has set the eligibility criteria for these benefits, such as SNAP and Medicaid and public housing and CHIP, to allow for immigrants who don't have a green card to access. And even under welfare reform, which President Clinton signed in 1996, restrictions were placed on immigrants' ability to access certain public benefits, but welfare reform did not affect many immigrants' eligibility for at least some forms of public assistance. Now, there are some rules around how long you have to be in the U.S. before you're eligible to access certain benefits, such as Medicare and TANF, as well as CHIP. But Congress has determined that immigrants are eligible for those programs. And so this rule essentially says, even though immigrants are eligible for these public benefits, use of or access to those benefits will then count against the immigrant if they are, to go and adjust their status at a later point. And so the answer to this question of does it affect someone's eligibility to receive public benefits is no. However, immigrants are then faced with this very difficult choice, which is to forego benefits that they are eligible for and qualify for because they're concerned about the effect on their immigration status and concerned about separation from children, especially in families that have U.S. citizens as well as non-citizens in the family, or to continue to use those public benefits because they know that these benefits are really vital to ensuring their children's health and productivity. However, that would potentially jeopardize their future immigration application and risk potential deportation. And so with that, I'll just pause since that was a lot of information about the current rule as well as the proposed rule, and just to see if there are any questions that anyone has on either the current rule or the proposed rule.
Hi, Veronica. Thank you for doing that deep dive. A little bit of an echo there, so if you want to mute real quick. There was a question that came in regarding the definition of long-term institutional care and where that crosses over with incarceration. In any of these proposed rules, anything you want to expound on when it comes to incarceration?
Great. So institutionalization for long-term care at the government's expense does not include incarceration. So as defined, that currently includes institutionalization in a nursing home or mental health institution and covered by Medicaid. So that's what institutionalization for long-term care means under the current rule.
Thank you. I don't believe there's been any other questions that have come in through the Q&A window. I hope that people will pose your questions. We aren't able to unmute. We have about 200 folks on today's webinar, which is fantastic. We just can't unmute folks. So please put your questions in the Q&A window. I will ask you this. I know it talks about you talked about the public charge comes into effect when people are applying for their green card, but certainly what's in the media right now are certainly folks coming up seeking asylum in the United States, and it would appear from your earlier slides that they would not be applied the public charge test. Could you talk a little bit more about that component, given where it is in the mediascape right now?
Sure, yeah. So there are certain categories of immigrants who are exempted from the public charge determination. So as we mentioned earlier, public charge is a ground of inadmissibility, but it doesn't apply to certain categories of immigrants, and that includes refugees and asylees, as well as other survivors of crimes. And so even when, so say someone who applies for asylum is approved for asylum and then later seeks to adjust their status to lawful permanent resident or applies for a green card, that asylum seeker would not have to go through the public charge determination. So we are talking about a subset of immigrants, and they are, again, not the immigrants who necessarily are in the news all the time, but people who have lawfully immigrated to the U.S., who are on family-sponsored or work-sponsored visas, who are looking to apply to stay in the U.S. longer term, those individuals who are, part of family-sponsored and employer-sponsored programs would be subject to the public charge determination.
Great, thank you. A few other questions have come in, so thank you. Mute me, okay. When considering HUD housing assistance, would that include assistance provided through the Permanent Supportive Housing or Emergency Solutions Grant funding?
That's a good question, and we don't know the answer off the top of our heads. The specific housing programs that are included are Section 8 vouchers, Section 8 rental or project-based rental assistance, as well as subsidized housing under a federal housing act. I think we just have to look to see whether those programs are covered under the federal housing act, since presumably they wouldn't be under Section 8. I'd be happy to follow up on that question after the webinar.
I think that would be great. My guess is that question will apply to a number of agencies, so that probably would be a good piece to do a bit of a deep dive on. A question came in about the slides. We will get those out to everyone who's attended by email this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. We'll also have them up on our website. Hopefully we'll have to figure out a way we do that. The size of the slides are huge. A question came in regarding the criminal record from the U.S. or their native country. Is there anything regarding a criminal record that's taken into consideration with the public charge rule?
So no, although criminal records are considered in an immigrant's application for lawful permanent status, that's just another grounds of inadmissibility, but it doesn't change in the proposed rule, and it doesn't factor into the public charge determination.
A question about, does the public charge have any impact on the child care subsidy? I believe not, but what?
Yeah, that's right. So again, child care is not included. Some folks may remember that soon after Trump's inauguration, so very close in time to the first executive order issuing the travel ban, there was a leaked executive order that addressed the public charge test. And so at that time, there were certain benefits that were rumored to be, on DHS's proposed list. That leaked executive order, was then issued as a proposed rule in October, but the list of public benefits that are included is different from that leaked executive order. So some folks may have heard about child care subsidies. I think Head Start was rumored to be on the list at that point, but in the rule as proposed, Head Start and other child care subsidies are not included.
Thank you. Do we need to be concerned with protecting our client databases since we are public entities and subject to open records? I'm from a state where there's been recent changes to LIHEAP rules, and they are requiring us to document immigration status in our client databases. Is there something that community action agencies should be thinking about in terms of their data?
So the issue of client data in CAA databases is not specifically related to this rule. Presumably, as immigrants applying to adjust their status, they would have to provide information about benefits that they receive or have applied for. So this is Eleanor, by the way, Evans at CAPLA. But, there are concerns generally about client data, immigrant and otherwise. And so, I think one thing I think that one should be careful with client data, whether it's for immigrants or otherwise, whether it's in electronic form or paper form, to have security procedures in place. And then in terms of agencies and law enforcement agencies or other government agencies requesting data is to, not just assume that because a law enforcement representative shows up or requests client data that you have to provide that data. And in many cases, a warrant may be required. So if folks get requests for data and you have questions about whether you need to provide that or not, you can feel free to call us here at CAPLA and we can help you think that through. And, this is an issue that that is becoming more important. And I would just say, and CAPLA may issue some future guidance around this or resources, just to be sure to have procedures in place that where you have, when requests for client data come in, that you have a central person at your agency who handles those requests and, if necessary, contacts outside counsel about that, and for staff not to assume just because a police officer or someone from ICE shows up and asks for documents that they have to provide those.
And I hope everyone on the phone knows that CAPLA is a wonderful resource. They answer their phones, and if they're not in the office, they get back to you very quickly. So hope that you take Eleanor's advice. If you run across something, pick up the phone, talk to CAPLA. Another question. Is there any sort of basis for people who do not have to adjust their immigration status? Let's say they already hold a permanent green card, they've already become naturalized citizens. Is there any concern for folks in those categories?
No, there's no concern. And once you have a green card, the public charge determination isn't reapplied when you actually, apply or to become naturalized. So it's just in the application for a green card process.
Someone's asking if there's been any comments from Congress or the Senate on these proposed rules. Anything you guys would like to share on things that you've heard or seen from Congress?
No, we haven't seen anything from Congress. I mean, we know based on that leaked executive order that this has been something on the administration's priority list sort of since day one, and so it took them a while to actually issue a proposed rule, but in many ways, I think we've been, ready for this day, unfortunately.
Yeah. Question tying it to CSBG. We know CSBG is not on the list, but similar to the question about the Emergency Solutions Grant, do you think there could be a potential risk that CSBG, funds that are used to provide stipends, for instance, for job training programs, could be considered a cash assistance program?
No, not that we're aware of. The cash assistance that DHS is considering is, when cash is transferred to an individual for income maintenance, and so I don't think we're concerned at this point that the use of CSBG funds or receipt of CSBG services would count. So the way that the public charge determination works is that immigrants, when they are applying for a visa or a green card, have to submit essentially a form that asks if they've received, certain public benefits. And so these are the benefits that would be included on that form. So immigrants would be certifying that they've received these and these only benefits. So it's not a broad, they're going to agencies to ask for information on specific immigrants. Now, there may be some verification, process, but as far as we know, CSBG is not included in the public charge determination.
The last piece really isn't a question, it's just a request for samples of things. We will be talking here at the end of the webinar and giving you a template. We'll also send you the template that has some kind of instructions about how to submit comments and what kind of frames you might want to consider using and how to use your own stories. I think one of the critical elements on submitting comments will be individual comments with your own perspective from your own organization. It does ask about sample appeals to use and promote within our community. I know that CLASP has done a lot of that work, as has the National Immigration Law Center. That might be a good place to find some more broader appeal kind of documents that can be used in social media. They have a great social media toolkit. The Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, which is chaired by CLASP and the National Immigration Law Center, or I can't remember the last letter in that acronym. But they, together, Protecting Immigrant Families, have a lot of great tools that you can use your own local community for more of a broad-based appeal for letters and comments from the broader public. So, Veronica, those are very thoughtful questions, folks. You guys always are right on spot. You know how this stuff applies to your agency, so thank you for those comments. Do you want to talk a little bit about your public charge FAQ, Veronica?
Yes, so there is an FAQ that we've released for community action, and that should be one of the handouts available for download on the webinar dashboard, and will be available on all of the national partners' websites. This is just a brief 3-page document that gives you an overview of the public charge test, so a lot of what we've covered on this presentation, and then also talks about the template comments that Denise and Eric will be discussing later in the slide. So this is just a link to those FAQs that you can share with other staff at your agencies.
Great. Thank you. And we will also make that available as well, and we'll probably put it into the Q&A window for you as well. All right. So, Veronica, I believe we're handing it over to me, or are we sticking with you? I'm sorry, I forget.
No, we'll hand it over to you, Denise.
All righty. Just put the ball back in my. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's keep moving. Let's talk a little bit about some of the impact of the proposed rule on community action. There's a lot of different details. There's a lot of things that can or could. I think one of the most important things certainly is the chilling effect. Regardless of whether or not a particular family is going to be impacted, this is going to impact the entire immigrant community. It's hard enough to communicate sometimes about rules and regulations, just about existing programs, but when you add this element of fear on top of it, there's going to be some significant education. So we are concerned about large-scale disenrollment of immigrants from public benefit programs. And as you heard Veronica say earlier, the current public charge rule excluded certain things primarily because it was related to health and safety of families, of children, of seniors. So we are concerned that even those not affected by the rule will remove themselves, not apply for programs, and put themselves and their families in situations that they would unnecessarily need to do. That we're concerned that they'll be reluctant to access any form of health care. To know that CHIP is even being discussed is very chilling. To take away health care from children, what mom isn't they're going to take the health care away from herself first in those situations? So we are very concerned about folks not accessing care and what that will have as an impact on the health and safety of families. We'll be concerned about immigrants losing status if they find themselves being subject to the public charge test and failing the public charge test. Will that mean that they then are subject for deportation? And what does that mean? Already we know that ICE is showing up places. We read stories every day. We've heard from local agencies about what's been sometimes going on in the field, fear even of staff of local agencies. And then certainly the concern about being deported and detained. Macro concerns, right? We have increased health expenditures, possibly associated with food insecurity. Uncompensated health care costs. If someone is then not accessing preventive health care, they end themselves perhaps in emergency situations, and the cost of supporting separated children. And again, we hear stories about parents, all of a sudden they are developing, we know CAP agencies are actually helping families develop emergency plans. If mom or dad gets picked up by ICE during the course of the day, doesn't arrive home by a certain time, where does the kid go after school? Where does the child go? Is there a plan in place? And families are having these conversations, and local agencies are helping these families have these conversations. So the cost of supporting these separated children will certainly weigh on communities, and certainly we're seeing that at the border right now with kids who have been separated from their families. The experts recommend that as many as 26 million people and families may be afraid to participate in programs and services that could help their families stay strong. 26 million people. That is a significant number of people and families across this country. And 1 of 4 children have an immigrant parent in our country. The impact of the proposed rule by race and ethnicity, you'll see here approximately 18 million Latinos may be impacted by the public charge rule. That's 33% of all of our Latino families here in the state. And you'll see the other breakdowns here as well. The potential impact on community action, certainly in our customers. We know many local agencies are engaged in Section 8, Housing Choice Vouchers, project-based Section 8. We know that this will impact local agencies, it'll impact local families, it'll impact perhaps decreasing your applications, which I know sometimes when there's huge waiting lists for public housing vouchers, but in many places we don't want to cut people off these lists because they are fearful of applying for services. By not having stable housing, we know that families will have increased risk of homelessness and less stability over time. The concept of SNAP being included in such a program, again, it kind of goes to the CHIP concept, and I know many of us are concerned about SNAP in a variety of ways, but that when you're not allowing families to, even in a short-term situation, apply for SNAP, you'll have increased hunger, lack of nutrition, an increased burden on local agencies' food pantries perhaps, local churches, faith-based organizations, and other community services that people might access without having to apply necessarily in other ways. It's that rumor and innuendo that in a lot of ways we fear at a very high level, the chilling effect, the inaccurate information and the fear factor that's being sent out. We really will need to rely on community action to make sure local folks have the right information. We're able to tell folks accurately what's going to happen. What's happening right now, though, we just don't know what will happen, right? So we don't also need to be clear and honest with our families as well. So we'll need to make sure that we're doing our best to keep our families calm but connected. That last bullet here, trauma-informed care. I know many agencies have invested in getting staff training on trauma-informed care. We know about adverse childhood experiences. When children experience different traumas in their life, their long-term health aspects change dramatically. And we believe that this change could, again, we're impacting children at very young ages with potential additional homelessness, potential additional hunger, lack of going to school, things like that. Because you see here, even though Head Start is not included, and you heard Veronica say earlier that it was proposed in that first initial draft, that first initial draft was way, way far out there. And granted, they did come back a bit, which we were pleased by. We're still very nervous by the proposed rule. But again, it's that chilling innuendo that even though early childhood is not impacted necessarily by this proposed rule, what will it do to our enrollment rates? Now, that has one impact on families, but we also know if you're running a Head Start program, we know there's a lot of pressure on Head Starts to make sure you're keeping your enrollment at a very high level. And we know when it comes to monitoring and recompetition issues, maintaining enrollment levels, that's a practical business aspect of the impact of this rule that we want to make sure people are kind of having in the back of their mind. And WIC, certainly I believe that's not included at the moment, but again, we know many of you run WIC clinics, so you're going to want to have accurate information. You're going to want to have that information available for families, and just be aware that families are going to be coming in with additional questions. Now again, LIHEAP is not on the list, but we also know that the chilling effect may depress and decrease LIHEAP applications. And whether you're in the hottest part of the country or the coldest part of the country, heat can kill, and cold, if it's cold enough, it certainly can, but it also has a lot of other health impacts on families, and we know the vital role that LIHEAP plays on the health of children, seniors, adults. It has a true health impact. Free and reduced lunch, again, not included, but again, a concern that families may find themselves less apt to apply or put their names on the list because of the potentiality later or the fear factor of what could come down the pike. Now, EITC and the child tax credit are not included, but we know many organizations are getting ramped up for VITA, the Voluntary Income Tax Assistance Program, where you are helping families access EITC and the child tax credit, and even if you're not a VITA site, you're promoting EITC. Again, these may be, concerns that you need to have good information on. Be there to make sure your volunteers are aware of this concern. Given that you're using volunteers from a variety of sectors in those VITA rooms, want to make sure that if they hear something from their customers about some concern, that you have training or material or information that you can provide them. So how can you weigh in on these changes? We want to make sure by December 10th we get a fair showing of community action responses. The partnership's going to be submitting comments individually, and we're hoping all the national partners will be submitting comments. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's been doing the deep dive for us and helping us put together the tool that we'll send out to you around how do you submit comments and what are some of the things you want to contemplate. Eric, we'll turn the ball over to you.
Hi, everyone. As Denise said, we're going to transition to showing you how you can weigh in on these changes. So thank you, Veronica and Denise, for all the information, and we're going to transition, kind of make that actionable and show you how to put it into practice. So comments need to be submitted by December 10th. That's the end of the comment period. But as you'll see, we've done a lot of the legwork for you to really help you develop those comments. You can kind of categorize comments into two different categories: organizational comments, on behalf of your community action agency, your association, the state office, and that's really what our template comments that you'll see in a moment speak to. And those are really in-depth comments where you can include data and specific impacts in your community, and those are submitted directly through the regulations.gov portal. But we also encourage individual comments. Any person can make a comment on a federal proposed rule, and so we recommend protecting immigrant families, but there's a lot of different organizations and coalitions out there where you can type in your own personal comments, and those will be submitted through their portals to the regulations.gov as well. Moving on, in the packet that you'll get in a follow-up to this webinar and on the National Partners websites, we have template comments, and they are customized for agencies, associations, and state offices. The comments are very similar, but just tweaked slightly so that the voice and the perspective is coming from those various constituencies. So definitely, if you are, no matter whether you're an agency or you're a state office or a local or an association, you'll be able to have a template that fits your organization. So looking at the local agencies, we've highlighted in yellow where you can insert your organization name and insert your specific data and information that is relevant to you. And the comments are most effective if they're specific and unique, and they have data and they're really rich telling the story. There's going to be a lot of comments received that are very generic, and we want to make sure that the community action comments are very rich and robust as well. When I checked last week, there was sitting over a little over 50,000 comments so far on the rule nationally. This week it's upwards around 80,000 comments. And I know the goal of a lot of the advocacy groups and coalitions is to get over 100,000 comments on this proposed rule. Additionally, in the template comments for the local agencies and on the others as well, we have some additional focused arguments for 3 specific programs. So if your agency runs Head Start or works with food nutrition or workforce development, we have some specific language and arguments that focus on those programs. And again, there are highlights showing you where you can customize that and add in your own data. Again, state association comments looks very similar, but with the state association voice kind of speaking to that statewide network. And then the same with the state comments, looking as if you're a state CSBG office, or perhaps you are a state WAP office, or your state office runs CSBG, weatherization, LIHEAP, a lot of these programs. This is kind of customized so you from the state voice can express your comment and use a lot of these arguments really easily. Quickly, a note on state CSBG offices. NASCASP, we are the association for all the state CSBG offices. We want to remind folks to make sure you know your state policies and procedures for commenting on proposed rules. You might need to work with a government relations office in your state. And then also we recommend collaborating with other areas of state government, get buy-in from other agencies. Maybe your state office does CSBG and another state office does WIC and those other things and oversees other human services programs. And then again, looking at the higher level of state government submitting the comments could have a larger impact. This is what the regulations.gov portal looks like. So if you get the slides here, you can click that link. There's basically a comment box. There is an option to upload files, so you could upload a PDF or Word document copy of your comments as well. You could even upload a success story or something like that to really hit home your points that you're making in your comments. These are just some quick tips from regulations.gov for submitting effective comments. We have a link in here to the full list, but really they want you to show data and facts and also establish yourself as an expert and having experience and credentials to comment on that rule. And I think that whether you're a state office or you are a local agency or association, Community Action is a trusted community partner with years and years of experience working with people in poverty, working with immigrants. So in the template comments, we've worked to establish you as experts, but including your own data and information will further that as well. And then there are, of course, other advocacy avenues. You could take the arguments in the comments, in the FAQ, and take that to social media, take that to your local media in an op-ed, and you can really do a lot that has been suggested by coalitions like Protecting Immigrants' Families campaign to elevate this message and really show opposition to the rule and based upon how it impacts the work that you all do. So I know I was trying to be brief because we're set for an hour, but I'll turn it back over to Denise.
Thanks, Eric. Yep, we want to make sure we're hitting the high points and answering your questions here, so thank you. And like Eric said, this will be in the recording. You can rewind pieces of the recording. You can link right to that place and submit your comments. And again, we're going to have a template. In the email that you'll get either tonight or tomorrow, we'll have the slides, we'll have the template, we'll have the FAQ again. All that will be available. Somebody asked if the FAQ could be made in Spanish. We could probably work with CapLaw to try to get that translated into Spanish. That might be helpful. My guess is also the National Immigration Law Center, as well as CLASP may have some of that, so we can do some research in that space as well. Let's see, are there any public national... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, Denise, I just wanted to mention that some of the national immigration advocacy organizations, like the National Immigration Law Center and CLASP, I believe, have FAQs in Spanish for families, and so we'd be happy to pull those and maybe send those to you to distribute to the attendees on the webinar as well.
That'd be great. Thank you. Question, are there any national public awareness alerts or information campaigns planned concerning the proposed changes and the implication for those affected in their communities? I think in response to that question, it would probably be the coalition that's been working over the last few months between CLASP and the National Immigration Law Center have really been pushing and developing materials. And you're really, FRAC, I know the Food Research Action Council did a webinar 2 weeks ago, I want to say, focused specifically on the food bank community. I know there's a lot of there's macro stuff going on, and then we're trying to do deep dives into various sectors in terms of getting the word out. Right now, I don't believe there's any real national public awareness campaign about it. They're hoping to generate, I believe, 100,000 comments, and I think we talked yesterday on our prep call that they were at about 75,000 comments having been submitted already, so the push is working in order to get comments in, but we need to hit that 100,000 number, and we need Community Action's voice at that table. The more, not just the merrier, the more and more important. So that looks like all the questions that have come in. Folks also have said that they have found this practical and helpful, so we are happy about that. Please feel free to share the information with your staff, with your colleagues. CapLaw has a wealth of information always. They are always an important call if you run into a particular problem, or if you have law enforcement or ICE showing up at your door asking for information. You have right to legal counsel, and we have legal counsel sitting up there in Boston waiting to work for us and with us. And what other national network of nonprofits have the attorneys like we do at CapLaw? So please take advantage of their expertise. And states, you have your own issues and hurdles you have to go through, and NASCAP is the expert on how to navigate state politics and state bureaucracy. And many of your states probably have submitted or hopefully are in the process of submitting comments, and hopefully you can add your voice to their work as well. Eric and Veronica, Eleanor, anything else you want to put on the table?
Nothing from us. Thanks, everyone.
Same here at NASCAP. Just reach out if you have any questions.
Great. Thanks, everyone. In January at our winter conference in New Orleans, we will have a plenary session with a key leader from UNIDOS, that's the new name for the Council of La Raza. We hope that you will join us as we continue our conversation of immigration and the challenges facing low-income Americans. So we're glad to have you here, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great rest of your week. Take care. Bye-bye.